Good afternoon to everybody in Europe and good morning in US, in Dayton, Ohio. I'm Ugo Trambali, Senior Advisor of ISPI and columnist with Il Sole 24 Ore, which is the Italian equivalent of Financial Times. Our meeting today is part of our pre-Mediterranean dialogues, the long but resolute path toward the 7th annual ISPI Med Summit next December. In flesh and blood again, we hope, inshallah. We are here today because we would try to figure out if Lebanon is really going to be a never-ending crisis, or we can see some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. Let me read some, last week, the Lebanese Prime Minister, Hassan Diab, made an interview with Financial Times. So let me read some short abstract of the interview. Describing his job, Diab says, "It is the only job in the world where you resign and then you are stuck." And again, waiting an extra week for Hariri to form a cabinet is like aggravating the economic and financial situation an extra year. And again, regarding the financial and economic crisis, that describe it as an acute financial disaster. And last but not least, of course, Diab described himself as a hostage of Lebanese politics, of the way politicians have been running policies in these countries for decades. Hardly I can see any sort of flame at the end of the tunnel. But how is that? I mean, how for decades the sectarian partition of power saved Lebanon from a reiteration of civil war and guaranteed a sort of democracy that we could not see in the rest of the Arab world. And now this model, this really model, is the trap of Lebanon. Why? Is Hassan Diab hostage only of the Lebanese politicians, or also of the too many regional and international characters that crowd the Middle East scene today? Why, in about 6 months, al-Hariri was not able to form a new cabinet? And is there some more responsible than others, or if you wish, or the disaster is a collective enterprise? Again, I conclude again with the interview of Diab. The conclusion is that there is a clear signal from everybody, not just the region, but internationally, to be careful not to open up financially and economically, because they consider this cabinet a Hezbollah cabinet. Well, we will discuss about it with Joseph Bahout, the director of Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the IUB, the American University of Beirut, with Marina Kalkuli, lecturer at the Leiden University in Holland, and she worked for a long time at the IUB also, and Randa Slim, senior fellow, Middle East Institute, and a non-resident fellow at the Johns Hopkins University in Mass Avenue in Washington, D.C. I will start with Joseph. Help us to help you is the mantra of the international community. The mantra is a call, it's a dramatic call. I mean, the international donors are ready. France got a clear program for Lebanon. Also, the ancient sectarian friends of the region are able to give money to Lebanon, to give the necessary financial aid to Lebanon. But nevertheless, why it's so difficult for the Lebanese to give us the chance to help them?
First of all, thank you very much, Ugo, for moderating this important panel and for gathering me with good friends. Some of them I've never met yet, and some other I miss. And thank you for ISPI to really devote this time to a Lebanon that is, to put it really frankly sinking today. I mean, it's not anymore at the crossroads, or I mean, all these metaphors that you can read here and there. It has resolutely taken the road towards hell, I could say, or towards the brink, at least. And really, I think that now we're engaging in a kind of autopsy and not anymore in an analysis of what could be done, unfortunately. Now, to answer your question more, of course, there are some conjunctural points in your questions related to Hassan Diab and the government, related to this or that initiative or etc. We'll probably get to that during the debate. But to answer your question and relate to what you have said in introduction, a kind of broad depiction of the Lebanese, let's say, conundrum, or the Lebanese predicament, I could say, I would say that the country is both the victim of its regional environment, and you have alluded to it. It is also the victim of its sectarian political system that has now probably reached an end, a logical end, and probably the serious homework of the Lebanese should be to start thinking about what to replace, what would replace and what could replace this sectarian system. And then you have something else that could be related to sectarianism, but is also something else that has to do with the nature of the political elite, this kind of voracious predatory system with no accountability, with endless corruption, that has to do with sectarianism, but also has to do with other things, the lack of accountability and extreme cynicism, a kind of denial in which not only the political class, and here I don't want to sound a little bit Marxist or something like that, but not only the political class, but the dominant class in Lebanon, the financial elite, the financial, let's say, oligarchy, and the political class colluded, a kind of complete insensitivity to the ordeal of the Lebanese. I mean, we're living in a country that is, and it's not an image, that is completely sinking. Electricity is about to be cut. We maybe in a month of now be in total blackout. The sanitary system is exploding. The deposits of the Lebanese, what they have earned during all their lives is concretely evaporating in front of their eyes. Violence is waiting at the door. It's now a social violence. It could become a political violence. And in facing all that, you have a kind of deaf and completely blind political structure, dominant structure that is insensitive, in denial, and ready to maybe burn the country in order to keep the country under its grip and its control. And I'm here borrowing the Syrian metaphor, you know, Assad or we burn the country. In fact, we're discovering today that many Assads in the region are ready to burn their countries in order to stay in power and to keep the grip on it. Now, the regional issue, you've asked me about the financing and etc. Yes and no, because in fact, the French initiative that has tried to bring a kind of temporary oxygen to the comatose body of Lebanon is not exactly, in fact, a long-term solution. We know that the long-term solution is partly predicated on the regional grand bargain if one day it happens. Iran, US, Gulf, etc. It is predicated also on the necessity by the Lebanese to really acknowledge that the operating model of the country is today completely over. It has maybe produced a kind of success story for some decades before the war, maybe a small decade after the war. But this operating model today of a kind of rentier, indirectly rentier state that is living on remittances of the expats, on high interest rates, on real estate bubbles, on clientelism, on very shallow social protection, on non-productive economy, on clientelistic political structures that are sometimes feudal, sometimes modern, but clientelistic. All this operating model is today dead. We have to acknowledge this. the attempts to rejuvenate this model under any pretext or slogan is today not only unrealistic and completely out of reality, but it is also criminal, because it only will prolong the lifeline or the artificial lifeline of a body that is already dead. So I think that, yes, we have to wait for a regional resolution of a sort, and maybe Randa will talk more about this because she follows what happens on the front of Iran and etc. Yes, it is a condition, it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. If the Lebanese don't start to do seriously their homework themselves on the way they want to approach the next century or the next decades, economically, politically, culturally, philosophically, etc. And this is a homework that they have really taken a lot of delay in starting. If they don't do it, whatever the regional solution, whatever the French initiative, whatever the help that Saad or other packages will give the country, this will fall really in a kind of pierced basket and on flat earth. I think the Lebanese have to really face the fact that everything that has been done was baby nice, maybe sometimes rosy. It has also produced some catastrophes, a war, a lot of inequalities, social tensions, and etc. But now it's time to move on and to move ahead and really look at ourselves with a lot of sincerity and lucidity, and start building a new Lebanon for the coming decades and century. This will have to do with, of course, rethinking the Lebanese productive economy. It will have to pass through rethinking the power sharing system. I know that sectarianism, and you have said it, has sometimes maybe protected Lebanon from being completely contaminated by ruthless autocracies that are multiplying and mushrooming abroad in the region. But at the same time, you have also to accept that this sectarian construction has also produced a lot of paralysis, a lot of dysfunctioning, a lot of frustration in the youth, a lot of clientelism, and a lot of, in fact, criminal economy and criminal political behavior. Look only at the port blast and the way the political class has approached it with the sectarian toolkit that it has into its hand. And then the country will have also to think about its role and place within a region that is today seriously under transformation. The region is today completely reshuffled, not only what will happen with Iran and the West, but also the Gulf states themselves. The political economy of the region is completely under transformation. We cannot live like in the 60s or the 70s. There is this new convergence between Israel and the Gulf states. There are shifts of power in the global scene, Russia, China, new actors, and etc. Lebanon has to find an inventive and creative way of existing within this very difficult and very complex puzzle in the region and in the world. And I think that all these points are the points of the agenda for any serious reform and resurrection of the country, whatever happens outside the borders of the country. We could have had a hope in October 2019 when people took to the street that this agenda of change and reform was at last finally on the table. But I think that today we have also to be lucid and severe enough and say that the Lebanese people and the Lebanese elite, the social elite, were also themselves not at this rendezvous, at this very important meeting, and they have failed, in fact, I think, their national duty in starting to work thoroughly on what Lebanon can be and must be if this country has to survive a new century in its existence.
Thank you, Joseph. So right or wrong, the international, regional and international perception of Lebanon, of the government, is that it's a Hezbollah government, as Diab said. Marina, what is the Hezbollah role? I mean, the real the concrete, the real agenda, Hezbollah's agenda, is a regional one or is a national one? What is more important for Hezbollah, to be part of the regional dispute, or to try to do something in his own country?
Well, first of all, thank you, Ugo, and thank you, ISPI, for organizing this important event. Is also, I have to say, as a person who has lived, studied, and worked in Lebanon, it's extremely painful to talk about what's happening in Lebanon at this moment in time. Regarding Hezbollah, well, and the regional/domestic role of Hezbollah, I think that Hezbollah has clearly a very important regional role, which defines itself and which Hezbollah cannot avoid. But at the same time, Hezbollah cannot survive without a stable Lebanon. And this is, I think, the trap in which Hezbollah is stuck into at the moment. The role of Hezbollah in the crisis, I think, is it's invested by a sort of tragic irony. And what do I mean by this? Is that I think, if we want to really understand the structural origins of this crisis, and I think Joseph was also alluding to that, I think we cannot simply focus on the present juncture. I think we need to look back in time. And so the system, the dysfunctional system, the architectonic of this dysfunctional system, which has now exploded in the face of the Lebanese, very similar to the way the port exploded on 4 August, traces its, has its origin in part at the end of the Civil War, when a new economic and financial system was rebuilt. But also, I think we can even go back in time. If one reads the wonderful book by Hisham Safieddine, Banking on the State, it's really, so we need to look for the colonial origins of this extremely dysfunctional system. So in both occasions, so when we look at this, when we look at the present crisis in a historical perspective, I think that Hezbollah has no real responsibility, active responsibility, for a matter of time, because Hezbollah did not really play a role in constructing this system. And also because even after the war, Hezbollah relied very much on an autonomous financial and economic network through which it funded its social welfare and also its military activities. Now, this passivity turns into active responsibility because Hezbollah has actively supported the political system that it has, that's also part of the tragic irony. Hezbollah is traditionally criticized and stigmatized the sectarian system, but then it came to a compromise. It came to terms with it, and it tried initially, and that was mainly in 2005, when there was a very important turning point for Hezbollah, when Hezbollah decided to enter government, to integrate further into the political system. And that was for a reason. That was a matter of survival for Hezbollah. Hezbollah needed new allies and also needed rivals in order to use the political system, the Lebanese political system, as a sort of shield to protect itself from the external pressure coming mainly from the United States in the framework of the war on terror. And for a time, Hezbollah was even able to become a sort of arbiter of the system after, for instance, 2008, the Doha reconciliation, when it obtained the right for the 1/3 of the cabinet to veto the decisions of the prime ministers, and so to play a very active role within the system. And in 2019, I think, that was a further tragic, ironic element in this. The social crisis erupted as a consequence of the financial and economic crisis. And Hezbollah was at the zenith of its power, of its political power, following the 2018 elections. And of course, it was, of course, considered responsible as much as the other members of the political elite. And in 2019, Hezbollah had a choice to make, and it very clearly chose to side with the political elite, with the system that the people were contesting and were questioning the legitimacy of. Nasrallah has displayed since 2019 a very conservative discourse, protecting the status quo, protecting the system as it is, and even protecting the sectarian system. Now, it is very clear that Hezbollah is no longer the arbiter of this domestic financial system, and it needs its allies, but also its rivals, much more than their allies and rivals need it. And I think it's also very clear in these days, if we read really the current events. On the one hand, Hezbollah is ready to support the formation of a Hariri government, but at the same time it wants to maintain a good relation with Aoun and Jabran Basil, so the Christian allies, which are now in opposition to Hariri, which are disputing with Hariri. And at the same time, Hezbollah also needs to maintain its alliance with Amal, the other Shia party, because one of the priorities of Hezbollah is to maintain the cohesion of the Shia basis. But at the same time, Amal is also in very bad relations with Jabran Basil and Michel Aoun. So it's no longer the arbiter. It's actually stuck in this game of alliances and rivals. Now, that's really why I think it's important to look at Hezbollah as a domestic actor, because Hezbollah cannot exist as a regional actor without being, without a stable Lebanon. There is also, an additional element in this crisis that has to do more with the relationship between Hezbollah and its base, which is connected, right, to the financial crisis that Lebanon is facing now. So there is an additional pressure on Hezbollah that comes from U.S. sanctions, that comes from this uncertainty about the possibility of a new deal between Iran and the U.S., and then perhaps Rwanda will have more to say about that. But this crisis has extremely impoverished its base. It has also curbed the possibilities, the capacity of Hezbollah to put money into its own economy. Although we have to say that now at the present time, Hezbollah is a little bit better off than other Lebanese parties, because it gets dollars from Iran, and so it pays salaries, at least part of the salaries, in dollars, not in Lebanese liras, and so it's somehow in a better position. But there is a structural gap between the rich and the poor of Hezbollah's base. Which is not new. This is not something that has emerged now, but it has become more visible and also more intolerable in the perspective of those people who might still be ready to support Hezbollah ideologically and politically, but obviously do not tolerate the fact that they are coping with an extremely dire situation where other members of the party are much better off. And so they blame Hezbollah for its incapacity to distribute resources equally. And here, there is a red thread between this sort of incapacity of Hezbollah to deal with or to negotiate or somehow to cope with its very strange, unholy relation with a political class that it has never supported, that it has also always criticized, but now has become so vital for it, and also its internal base, which is, I think, and that also relates to what Joseph was saying earlier, a complete lack of economic vision. Hezbollah is a security actor. It has a very clear security vision of the region and of Lebanon, but it completely lacks an economic vision. It doesn't know how to play, how to cope with this crisis. It can criticize, for instance, the IMF loan because he understands that it might come with some conditions imposed by external powers on Lebanon that might, in the long run, affect its role and even constrain its role in Lebanon, but it doesn't offer an alternative. It doesn't even, I'm going to conclude. It doesn't even offer a viable alternative. And of course, this lack of vision, this lack of economic vision obviously plays in the hands of their rivals, especially external powers, who are clearly ready to somehow use this crisis in order to impose reforms on Lebanon. And especially, I think, from the perspective of the United States, at least so far, the US have been somehow keen to impose some conditions of Lebanon that envision, that entail in the long run the elimination of Hezbollah from the political scene.
Thank you very much, Marina. Randa, do you agree with the initial picture that Joseph made before? And let me add, is the Biden administration interest in they have a foreign agenda which is very huge, from China to Middle East to Russia to Latin America to Quad, etc., etc. Does the Biden administration we will have time enough to dedicate to Lebanon? And if yes, what will be the posture on Hezbollah, considering also what Marina just said? Please, Randa.
Thank you, Ugo, and good to be with Joseph and Marina, and thank you, ISPI, for organizing this panel today. I pretty much agree with the scene setter that Joseph provided about both the antecedents to the crisis of today, and then also the kind of wall the crisis has hit, but also what are the needs for the future, which is a new vision, a new, as Joseph put it, operating model. Now, building on just a little bit on what Marina has said, and in terms of the role of Hezbollah, is also we have seen Hezbollah use its military status, its military infrastructure in Lebanon, to also change political dynamics, to move countries out of the country out of a paralysis, for example, into a new deal. So, 2008, for example, the May 2008 incursion in Beirut was an attempt, an intentional attempt by Hezbollah under the pretext of responding to decrees by the cabinet at the time that were not to their liking in terms of their communication infrastructure, but it was an effort by Hezbollah, or a tactic, if we can put it this way, to create new political dynamics and force the other political elite through fear tactics, through changing their cost-benefit calculus by force into Doha and the Doha Agreement. Now, is Hezbollah contemplating something like that? I think they might. Mr. Nasrallah's speech last Thursday referred to this kind of scenario indirectly when he said, when he warned his partners in the political, among the political elites, that if things remain stuck, they might have to resort to other scenarios. And in my opinion, he was referring to the May 2008 scenario. The question is that geopolitical situation environment in 2008 was different from the geopolitical environment of today, especially in terms of the United States, how Arabs, as where Arabs are vis-a-vis the United States, Arab Gulf states, where the Arab street is vis-a-vis the United States. We had the Bush administration in 2008. We had the aftermath of the Iraq occupation, the U.S. occupation of Iraq. So you had an Arab Sunni street that that was pretty much anti-US, and basically Hezbollah bet then that any kind of intervention against a Sunni majority city will not have major consequences. I mean, the cost will be much more bearable than the benefit of moving the situation toward a scenario which eventually turned out to be pretty beneficial for Hezbollah and their allies, meaning the Doha Agreement. Today, it's different. The geopolitical situation in terms of US-Arab relations is different. The Arab-Sunni street is different, you know, they have, especially after Syria and Hezbollah's role in that. The dynamics in Lebanon themselves are different, and there are always fear of things getting out of control. When in 2008, you know, Hezbollah was pretty confident that it was going to be a short-term intervention and that its damage was going to be controllable by them. I don't think they can make the same assumption. So I agree with Joseph when he said there is now social violence, and we have seen, according to ISF statistics, the increase on year to year in the number of homicides and thefts prompted by basically people desperation, but also breakdown in social networks, breakdown in social cohesion. We have seen the increasing rates of violence against women, for example, you know, against minors. So that's, we are going to see more of that going forward. But also this social violence is going to translate eventually into political violence, because as the scenario of implosion unfolds, and it is definitely heading there and heading there extremely quickly, we are going to see communities starting to resort to self-defense. We have seen them do that during the COVID pandemic, when many villages and towns tried to do roadblocks to prevent people from leaving towns or new people from entering their towns that can bring COVID into their town and their villages. You are going to see an acceleration in the self-defense mechanisms by communities and villages, you know, taking up arms, you know, more of the us versus them mentality setting in at the communal level, and that could lead to the kind of, you know, more the violence than we have seen today, and that still I don't see we have the conditions in place for a civil war, particularly because Hezbollah does not want a civil war. There will not be a civil war in Lebanon if Hezbollah, I mean, there will be a civil war in Lebanon only if Hezbollah wants one. But I think we don't, I mean, right now, definitely they are not interested in one, and I don't think that they see any you know, interest for them in the long term. So as Marina said, they are stuck, and but at the same time, I don't think they can sustain being stuck for a long time. So you're going to see them looking for different ways to get the situation unstuck, and we have seen other tactics being used in the past by Hezbollah and others to get political situation unstuck. And in my opinion, you know, the default option is to use the same methods. And we might see that in the future, in fact, in the near future. In terms of the US, I think there is a disconnect today between the sense of urgency, the sense of now that Lebanon is at, you know, and where the Biden administration is. I mean, after speaking from Dayton, Ohio, the priorities of the Biden administration are domestic. It is COVID and, you know, accelerating the vaccination programs, and they're doing a great job with that, in my opinion. And the economic situation. I mean, for the past decades, we were seeing a GDP growth of 2.17% on average. This year, they are predicting north of 6% economic growth, which is going to be humongous for this country. And that's going to be a big boost for the Biden administration. And as senior officials in the administration said often, that their approach to foreign policy starts at home, that they need to really, you know, take care of the problems. The priorities is taking care of problems at home. And so for the time being, basically are going to continue the Trump policy pretty much, you know, in many especially in the Middle East, except for example on Iran, where definitely you are seeing a push by the Biden administration to undo the maximum pressure strategy. But there are constraints there. There is definitely a will on the part of the Biden administration to engage in negotiations with Iran. There is definitely many overtures, messaging being sent. But also today is different than 2015. You have a good bipartisan support for maintaining some of these sanctions on Iran, for maintaining what they believe is leverage on Iran, and for engaging with Iran through more holistically. I mean, one of the lessons learned, not only by officials in the Biden administration, many of whom who were in the Obama administration and part of the negotiating team, but also by the political class, by the Congress, by the Republican, by the think tanks, is that focusing on the nuclear aspects of the relationship between Iran and the United States is not going to cut it anymore, and that we need to approach these negotiations through a more holistic sense. On one hand, needing to strengthen and lengthen the deal, as National Security Advisor Mr. Sullivan keeps saying, but on the other hand, also use this as a platform for follow-on negotiations on regional issues like, the Iranian proxy in the Middle East, on the Iranian ballistic missile program, and also other issues that Iran is going to bring to the table. Now, do I think that the administration will have the political will, stamina, standing once it tackles the nuclear file? Will it have the public support to move toward this, lengthy, complex negotiation on proxies, Iranian proxies, ballistic programs, others? I think it's going to require a really heavy diplomatic lift, not only from the US, but also from, its allies in Europe and from other members. And it will be constrained by this strategic competition that the Biden administration sees as being the primary driver of its national security doctrine, which is the competition with Russia and China. This competition will set the contours within which these nuclear negotiations will take place, but also the contours of the possibility of a future deal. And Lebanon is going to be addressed as an adjunct of these other policies, as an adjunct of Syria policy, as an adjunct of Iran policy. And right now, today, there is no Lebanon policy. There is a continuation of the Trump policy in terms of supporting the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, supporting civil society organization, supporting educational institutions like the AUB and LAU, supporting, pushing for reforms, US eventually taking a lead and encouraging IMF to basically proceed in terms of emergency and rescue package for the Lebanese government, for the Lebanese economy, conditional on reforms. But also, I think the Biden administration is going to be thinking about doing that not only as a solo actor, but as part of a multilateral effort that involves definitely France, the rest of the EU, that involves GCC. The problem right now is that there are GCC is not on board, when it comes to Lebanon. I think their experience with Lebanon has been over the years very discouraging, and an important factor is that you had an old leadership in the GCC, which no longer is on the scene, an old leadership that has really an emotional attachment to Lebanon. Many of them grew up in Lebanon, went to schools in Lebanon before the war, married Lebanese women. They had this kind of emotional attachment. And so when I speak today with officials, or people around senior leaders in the Gulf, you don't see that kind of emotional attachment. You don't see that rush to help Lebanon. And that's going to be a factor. The US will, in the future, want, when the time is right, to lead this multilateral effort, but it's going to be finding it very hard to get countries like the GCC to get on board, in support of initiatives, which I think are going to be needed in terms of supporting Lebanon.
Thank you. Thank you, Randa. Before I make a second round of my questions to the panelists, I remind to our viewer that we are going to, afterwards, we are going to have a round of your questions. So you can write your questions on our Zoom. Joseph, I come back to you. At the end of the day, they have to make up a government sooner or later, but how in this situation?
Yes. Look, I don't want to sound very bleak, but it's maybe one of these rare, not rare occurrences in Lebanon's recent history, political history, where you could maybe spend 1 or 2 years without the formation of a government, to say it bluntly. Look, the stalemate we've reached today on the government front is twofold. There are the macro reasons that Randa and Marina have plainly explained. Randa, especially on the regional front, the waiting for the Iran-US issue to unlock, and it won't unlock before probably the summer, the Iranian elections, before also the US makes up its mind on the process to pursue. But I think that, and here I come back like before to the Lebanese agency and its importance. The level, Hugo, of defiance, of untrust, of detestation, of personal antipathy between at least two actors, the president and his son-in-law on the one side and the prime minister designate on the other, has reached a level where I think it goes really deep. And it is by itself maybe an impediment today to any serious attempt at repatching things. Now, beyond the anecdotics, I mean that, okay, two persons detest each other. In politics, this is something that you can go over, etc. But I think, and this is where probably Lebanon is at really a crossroad existentially. Everybody knows that at the end of the mandate of Michel Aoun, Lebanon will be ripe to be transformed structurally, because the crisis in the region would have shifted to somewhere else, because Lebanon, as we said, the operational model has completely died, and etc. So in preparation of this, let's say, huge working site of reshuffling the cards in Lebanon, all actors are today seizing their cards as hostages in preparation for that. Let me be more concrete. Saad al-Hariri is ready to let Michel Aoun completely finish his mandate without a government, just to prove the point constitutionally that the designation of a Sunni prime minister is done and no one can change it. This is a constitutional point that is articulated on the personal antipathy. Michel Aoun is ready to stay 2 years in this situation, only not to allow Saad Hariri to form the government without him having a major say in it, because he considers that this is some of the last remnants of the Maronite president's prerogative. If one of them budges on these points, the new arrangement for Lebanon, the day things will happen in the region, a new Taif agreement will be crafted, a new COM agreement will be crafted, a new Doha, call it the way you want. The day it will happen, the precedents that are done today by these actors will weigh a lot on the way things will be reconstructed at that point. This is why I think that today the war of attrition between these two positions is open and enduring. Now, here we come to the third actor, the one Marina has developed at length, Hezbollah internally. Hezbollah is torn today, and it is living a set of contradictions, probably for the first time of its history, difficult contradiction to square. On the one hand, they don't want to break Hariri's will, because for them it has to do with the Sunni-Shia equilibrium. At the same time, they don't want to completely disavow their ally Michel Aoun, because for them it's the last cushion of Christian coverage they have. So they are navigating between the two. And believe it or not, I think that even their push today is not enough to unlock the stalemate in which we are, because they don't want to use additional force or pressure on one of the two elements of this equation for reasons of the future. The second contradiction in which they are, true, as Marina is saying, they want the equation of Hezbollah, like other Shia forces in Iraq or elsewhere, is to have a weak state and a strong militia, okay? But they want a state. They want a weak state, but it's a state, albeit, okay, nevertheless. The problem is that today the state is completely crumbling, both in political terms and in economic terms. And I fully agree with Marina that Hezbollah doesn't have an economic software. I mean, when Nasrallah talks economics on TV, it is laughable. I mean, it is really laughable. It is economics 101. It is economics for dummies. It doesn't hold the ground. So they don't know how to do it. So they want to preserve what is preservable of the state, but at the same time, social violence, social unrest, the dereliction of social fabric, and etc., could force them, and Randa said it, and I think she's right, could force them to be tempted, either involuntarily, to make a kind of coup de force in order to re-establish authority of the state. The problem is that they want something and the contrary, and this is why I think they are really looking forward with impatience to the moment where things will unlock on the regional scene between the US and Iran, because this will be their salvation in Lebanon. This will open up the avenues that they cannot open up in Lebanon today, because any avenue they would open up comes with a huge cost internally, domestically, within their constituency, and with their allies and their foes alike on the Lebanese scene. So Hezbollah, I think, is really in a conundrum today, and probably it will try to prolong, to do this kind of strategic patience Iran is very strong at, in order to wait for the good moment regionally to translate this new equation locally.
Thank you, Joseph. I just want to remind you that time, unfortunately, is running very fast. Marina, Randa gave us already a sort of pictures of the situation in the region. But how at the end of the day, is a Lebanon's implosion important for the region, for the so-called stability in the region?
Well, yes and no, because when you ask the question of stability, you always have to ask whose stability. And I think that we have at least two actors. One is the regional powers, and some of them might clearly have some interest, in my view, in seeing Lebanon imploding, and even in this very slow agony, while the entire world is unable or somehow unwilling to do anything. The other actor are the people who are indeed suffering, who are at the receiving ends of this spiral of instability. And of course, the second actor is in a much worse position. I think that there are two ways of looking at this potential Lebanese implosion. One is short term and the other is long term. And I think both very much depend on which solution will come out. And even no solution is a possibility indeed, but also building on what Joseph was saying, if not doing, not creating a government and continuing in this, maintaining this stalemate in these 2 years, which is somehow the time horizon that the political class has at this point, is not necessarily a sustainable solution, because social violence is already there, as Joseph and Randa have emphasized, and political violence can erupt. So I think that the implosion of Lebanon will very much depend on what unfortunately, external actors will do. I think that so far we have two two possible visions, which are not very well defined, but are somehow supported by the French and the American visions. And let me be very clear. So I also think that that both France and the United States are engaged in an imperial competition in Lebanon. They don't care that much about the safety of Lebanon and especially of the Lebanese people, but they clearly one is the US is a declining empire and France is a wannabe empire maybe, but both have interests in the region, and Lebanon is part of this game. So the French, especially at the beginning of the crisis, when Macron really was keen to take the lead of the reconstruction, especially after the explosion at the port of Beirut on 4 August, they were more keen to go for a more inclusive solution, a restructuring of the political system with some conditions here and there, but also including Hezbollah in this new game. But then the US, I think, was very clear in the Trump administration. Now we don't know what the Biden administration will do, but the Trump administration jumped in to make it clear that nothing can be decided without the US giving the green light. And the Trump administration was very clear that a solution for could not entail the integration of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is really the strategy of the US in Lebanon. I think is a very is informed by their security mentality and the will to completely eliminate Hezbollah from Lebanon and the region. And in this, they're very much in line with Israel and with the GCC, with the Gulf countries that support completely what the US is doing. So in the short term, I think it will very much depend on what the US will do. In the long term, I don't think that there is much hope, especially for the people, for the people. And we have seen already how other regions, how other states have imploded and have deteriorated into sort of chronic crisis from which is very hard to come out. Now, the only possible role that perhaps France could play, but again, it's not a structural solution, it's a very short-term solution. I think that France and Europe and the European Union and European countries are more keen to kind of solve or kind of find a solution for the social crisis in Lebanon, not because, once again, France or the European Union are interested in the fate of Lebanon and the Lebanese, but because they are afraid of a further migration crisis. Lebanon is already the host of an incredibly huge refugee population, and of course, if violence erupts if Lebanon implodes, of course, that would lead to a further migration crisis that, of course, Europeans, and so from that perspective, France would be ready to contain. Okay, I'm going to stop it there.
Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Randa, following up what Marina said and also following up what you said before, is there a chance, let's suppose that United States and Iran, they made an agreement, they all come back to the Iranian nuclear agreements, and the United States together with Europeans will cancel the sanctions. Could both the American and European attitude toward Hezbollah could change?
I keep saying that.
Oh, yeah.
In the Trump administration, there was no Lebanon policy. There was a Lebanon as far as the Trump administration, it was looking at Lebanon, looking at Iraq, looking at Syria through the Iran policy. And I think Biden is also looking at Lebanon, looking at Syria, looking at, the other through also an Iran policy. Albeit it's going to be a different policy. It's not a maximum pressure strategy, but still Lebanon is going to be looked at as an adjunct of an Iran policy. So, I mean, I wish, like Marina said, there is a competition, there is really an interest. I don't see that happening now. I don't see that happening in the future. I think it's going to be part of a deal, and if we get to that, as I said earlier, I'm very, very hesitant to endorse this idea that the United States, once it gets to its nuclear negotiation, which already are going to be very difficult, and once it goes beyond the lengthening, the renegotiation, the nuclear deal, which is definitely committed to, and for which there is bipartisan support, we are talking about 2 years from now. We are talking about the beginning of our electoral cycles, for Congress and all of this, the beginning of the presidential cycles in 2 years. So, I mean, it's going to be really difficult to foresee the Biden administration put the kind of political will and the political capital and the human resources that are going to require to really tackle very complex regional negotiation. And so I don't see that kind of urgency today. I don't see that kind of urgency in the future. I think whatever a deal needs to happen, it has to be in line with US interest, but US will not be driving that deal-making process. But at the same time, I cannot see a deal-making process happen without the US driving it. I don't see anybody else today in a position to drive a regional deal-making process. And at the same time, again, simultaneously, I don't see the US now, I don't see the US in 2 years from now interested in, again, expanding the capital, the resources to drive this complex deal-making process. And what we are going to see is what Joseph said, a reshuffling of the cards in the region. You are going to see more of the regional actors, competition, cooperation. We are seeing alliances remade. We are seeing old enmities trying to be addressed, Egypt, Turkey. We are seeing new alliances, the Abrahamic Accord. Saudi Arabia, after the demise of the king, might join the Abrahamic Accord. I think the GCC competition with Iran is here to stay. It might, go a bit down, a notch down, but I don't see that. So that deal-making process that will enable eventually Lebanon to move beyond this situation of stuck that it is in, I don't see it happening in the next 2 years, on the next 2-3 years. Maybe I'm being too pessimistic. And building on the point that you said, the senior officials in the Biden administration today who are in charge of Middle East policy are very much, empathetic to the Iran cause, are very much empathetic to and some of them empathetic to the Hezbollah cause in Lebanon. And so you are not going to see that much of a pushback from that group of senior officials in the Biden administration, against Hezbollah or against the continuation of the status quo, or even more power for Hezbollah in the future in Lebanon. I'm being too pessimistic, but really, I do not see the makings of that kind of regional deal-making process.
Thank you, Radha. Actually, our time is over, but I'll keep just 2 to 3 fast questions. I put together 2 questions, one about Netanyahu's Israel and the other one about the Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And the question I put together is, which one is the most dangerous frontier for Lebanon today, the southern one with Israel or the one with Syria? Second question, is there the possibility to put sanctions against Lebanese politicians? And if yes, what politicians? And again, considering the increasing frustration of the Lebanese people and the stubborn desire of the governing political class to remain in power. How do you assess the possibility that the parliamentary election might be postponed, something that Lebanon has frequently done before? And if so, do you think this could trigger another round of massive protests and even violence this time? 3 short questions. Do you choose the question you want to answer? Randa first.
You know, Biden administration now is undergoing a very good, in my opinion, an interesting and timely review of its sanctions policy. You know, what has worked, what has not worked. And we are not yet even at the stage of saying where they are coming, on which side they are coming. But I can see, you know, eventually sanctions remaining part of their policy menu, if we can put it, toward Lebanon. And especially given the personal emphasis of the President Biden on fighting corruption. This is a personal agenda of his that he has embraced when he was still in the Senate, and that's going to be a cornerstone, in addition to human rights, of his approach to countries around the world, but also especially to Lebanon. And so I can see the Biden administration using sanctions going forward in as a way, as part of a menu of how to say, actions toward Lebanon. However, I have to say that the message that the sanction, or the impact that sanctions can have, is going to be much more powerful if it is embraced by the rest of the international community. So, for example, if France comes on board, if the rest of the EU comes on board, and sanctions need also, if the sanctions are not only targeting elements that are seen to be anti-US or anti-West in Lebanon, but rather the whole spectrum of officials who basically have all been pro-US, pro-anti-US, who have been part of this political oligarchy that brought Lebanon to it today. So I think, awaiting that results of that review of its sanctions policy, I foresee sanctions being used in the future by the Biden administration, but also a push by the Biden administration to bring its allies in Europe, in GCC, on board with sanctions.
Thank you, Randa. Shukran. Marina.
Okay, I picked the question on the Syrian refugees and Netanyahu, who is more threatening. And first of all, I find it a very kind of strangely framed question, because these are two completely different actors. One is the prime minister of a state which is also a nuclear power, which is the most powerful state in the region. The other is not actually a threat, but I would say is a victim of the system. Certainly the presence of Syrian refugees on Lebanon has aggravated the crisis, but simply because the refugee crisis has intertwined with the social crisis already present in the country. So I think that they are the Lebanese, the poor Lebanese, those who are suffering for this crisis, and the refugees are two different groups, but both victims of this system of corruption, which is oppressing the population. The other one, I think, Netanyahu, and meaning the possibility of an Israeli interference with the crisis in Lebanon, I think is more likely. I think that perhaps I have a different position vis-a-vis what Randa said earlier. So perhaps the US are not interested right now in intervening more substantially in Lebanon, but certainly the US are ready to back whatever the Israelis want. And I think that Israel is not definitely ready to see Hezbollah becoming more powerful, or Hezbollah surviving in Lebanon. So the prospect of a new war between Hezbollah and Israel has always been there, and I think it's a matter of time, and it depends on how Hezbollah will come out of this crisis, whether it will survive and even become stronger as it has done in the past. Hezbollah has capable of, somehow reinventing its role in Lebanon or not. And so I certainly would opt for, the Israeli threat as the most threatening for Lebanon's stability, but definitely not the Syrian refugees.
Joseph, Faddal. No, we can. Hello, can you? You should put on your.
Joseph, I think you're muted.
Microphone.
I'm
okay?
muted.
Okay, now, yes, you're perfect.
I wanted to pick up the same question that Marina picked up, but I will take it, but differently. I will focus on one point. As someone who has, besides the fact that I'm Lebanese, but someone who has followed really Lebanon's politics for now more than 20 years, I'm really struck, surprised, and puzzled by the degree with which my compatriots, observers, analysts, and citizens alike, have completely shunned away lately Syria as an actor of their political life. People talk about Iran, Hezbollah, Yemen, the Gulf, the Biden administration, and they forget that for decades, their daily fate was determined by a regime that is at their door. And what strikes me is that we are now 2 months from a new re-election of Bashar al-Assad, that this regime is now off the hook. You like it or not, I don't like it, but it is off the hook for a while. And it will put its nose in Lebanon again. This is a law of nature. And no one in Lebanon is thinking about that. How will we live for the next 10 years with the Syrian regime intact? Besides us. And this is, for me, an important, very important question. Besides and beyond the refugee aspect, beyond and besides the Iranian, Iraqi, Syrian, Lebanon corridor, this is a relation that, in fact, is almost congenital with the Lebanon's entity. And we have to look at it again. And I'm struck by the fact that no one is really caring anymore about the dynamics within Syria, what is happening inside the regime, the way it is re-establishing its network in Lebanon and over the Lebanese political and social landscape. Refugee is one of the factors. Economic is one. Reconstruction of Syria is another, etc. Russia in Syria is the fourth one. And I think that it is maybe time within this agenda of things the Lebanese have to tackle, and I was talking about it in the beginning of this webinar. They also have to put the Lebanese-Syrian relation at the forefront of this national agenda in order to know what kind of Lebanon they want to do and to reconstruct for the next decades. And it will have to take into consideration what is happening in Syria, what will remain of Syria, who will govern Syria, and how it will be governed. So I think that, of course, a miscalculation on the southern border is very important. It could trigger a war over Lebanon. I think the level of deterrence between Israel and Hezbollah is such that this won't change really the equation. But in longer term, in structural terms, in sociological terms, I think what will happen not on the border with Syria, but beyond the border with Syria, in Damascus and beyond, in the interland, is crucial and crucially important for the fate and the future of Lebanon.
Well, thank you, shukran, merci. I hope to see you soon in a different style, but let's hope. I don't know how to, I don't want to have to say anything to finish. The only thing I feel living in Beirut in the 80s, starting my knowledge of Beirut in 1983, just to cover the destruction, the bomb at the American University sur la Corniche. Well, I love Beirut, I love Lebanon. So the only thing I feel to say is that que le Liban ne finira jamais. Inshallah. Thank you very much, shukran. Grazie.
Thank you. And
thanks.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Stay safe, everybody. Bye.